Story 24 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2012. Children's Book of Christmas Stories by various artists. Little Gretchen and the Wooden Shoe by Elizabeth Harrison. The following story is one of many which has drifted down to us from the story-loving nurseries and hearthstones of Germany. I cannot recall when I first had it told to me as a child, varied, of course, by different tellers, but always leaving that sweet, tender inspiration of God's loving care for the least of His children. I have since read different versions of it in at least a half-dozen storybooks for children. Once upon a time, a long time ago, far away across the great ocean, in a country called Germany, there could be seen a small log hut on the edge of a great forest, whose fir trees extended for miles and miles to the north. This little house, made of heavy-hewn logs, had but one room in it. A rough pine door gave entrance to this room, and a small square window admitted the light. At the back of the house was built an old-fashioned stone chimney, out of which in winter usually curled a thin, blue smoke, showing that there was not very much fire within. Small as the house was, it was large enough for the two people who lived in it. I want to tell you a story today about these two people. One was an old, gray-haired woman, so old that the little children of the village, nearly half a mile away, often wondered whether she had come into the world with the huge mountains and the great fir trees, which stood like giants back of her small hut. Her face was wrinkled all over with deep lines, which, if the children could only have read aright, would have told them of many years of cheerful, happy self-sacrifice, of loving, anxious watching beside sick beds, of quiet endurance of pain, of many a day of hunger and cold, and of 1,000 deeds of unselfish love for other people. But, of course, they could not read this strange handwriting. They only knew that she was old and wrinkled, and that she stooped as she walked. None of them seemed to fear her, for her smile was always cheerful, and she had a kindly word for each of them if they chanced to meet her on her way to and from the village. With this old woman lived a very little girl. So bright and happy was she that the travellers who passed by the lonesome little house on the edge of the forest often thought of a sunbeam as they saw her. These two people were known in the village as Granny Goodyear and Little Gretchen. The winter had come, and the frost had snapped off many of the smaller branches from the pine trees in the forest. Gretchen and her granny were up by daybreak each morning. After their simple breakfast of oatmeal, Gretchen would run to the little closet and fetch Granny's old woolen shawl, which seemed almost as old as Granny herself. Gretchen always claimed the right to put the shawl over her Granny's head, even though she had to climb onto the wooden bench to do it. After carefully pinning it under Granny's chin, she gave her a good-bye kiss, and Granny started out for her morning's work in the forest. This work was nothing more nor less than the gathering up of the twigs and branches which the autumn winds and winter frosts had thrown upon the ground. These were carefully gathered into a large bundle, which Granny tied together with a strong linen band. She then managed to lift the bundle to her shoulder and trudged off to the village with it. Here she sold the faggots for kindling wood to the people of the village. Sometimes she would only get a few pence each day, and sometimes a dozen or more, but on this money little Gretchen and she managed to live. They had their home, and the forest kindling furnished the wood for the fire which kept them warm in cold weather. In the summer time Granny had a little garden at the back of the hut, where she raised, with little Gretchen's help, a few potatoes and turnips and onions. These she carefully stored away for winter use. To this meagre supply, the pennies gained by selling the twigs from the forest added the oatmeal for Gretchen and a little black coffee for Granny. Meat was a thing they never thought of having. It cost too much money. Still, Granny and Gretchen were very happy, because they loved each other dearly. Sometimes Gretchen would be left alone all day long in the hut, because Granny would have some work to do in the village after selling her bundle of sticks and twigs. It was during these long days that little Gretchen had taught herself to sing the song which the wind sang to the pine branches. In the summer time she learned the chirp and twitter of the birds, until her voice might almost be mistaken for a bird's voice. She learned to dance as the swaying shadows did, and even to talk to the stars which shone through the little square window when Granny came home too late or too tired to talk. Sometimes, when the weather was fine, or her Granny had an extra bundle of newly knitted stockings to take to the village, she would let little Gretchen go along with her. It chanced that one of these trips to the town came just the week before Christmas, and Gretchen's eyes were delighted by the sight of the lovely Christmas trees which stood in the windows of the village store. It seemed to her that she would never tire of looking at the knit dolls, the woolly lambs, the little wooden shops with their queer painted men and women in them, and all the other fine things. She had never owned a plaything in her whole life. Therefore, toys which you and I would not think much of seemed to her to be very beautiful. That night, after their supper of baked potatoes was over, and little Gretchen had cleared away the dishes and swept up the hearth, because Granny dear was so tired, she brought her own small wooden stool and placed it very near Granny's feet, and sat down upon it, folding her hands on her lap. Granny knew that this meant she wanted to talk about something, so she smilingly laid away the large Bible which she had been reading, and took up her knitting, which is as much as to say, "Well, Gretchen dear, Granny is ready to listen." "Granny," said Gretchen slowly, "it's almost Christmas time, isn't it?" "Yes, dearie," said Granny, "only 5 more days now," and then she sighed. But little Gretchen was so happy that she did not notice Granny's sigh. "What do you think, Granny, I'll get this Christmas?" said she, looking up eagerly into Granny's face. "Ah, child, child," said Granny, shaking her head, "you'll have no Christmas this year. We are too poor for that." "Oh, but Granny," interrupted little Gretchen, "think of all the beautiful toys we saw in the village today. Surely Santa Claus has sent enough for every little child." "Ah, dearie," said Granny, "those toys are for people who can pay money for them, and we have no money to spend for Christmas toys." "Well, Granny," said Gretchen, "perhaps some of the little children who live in the great house on the hill at the other end of the village will be willing to share some of their toys with me. They will be so glad to give some to a little girl who has none." Dear child," said Granny, leaning forward and stroking the soft, shining hair of the little girl. "Your heart is full of love. You would be glad to bring a Christmas to every child. But their heads are so full of what they're going to get that they forget all about anybody else but themselves." Then she sighed and shook her head. "Well, Granny," said Gretchen, her bright, happy tone of voice growing a little less joyous, "perhaps the dear Santa Claus will show some of the village children how to make presents that do not cost money, and some of them may surprise me Christmas morning with a present. And, Granny dear," added she, springing up from her low stool, "can't I gather some of the pine branches and take them to the old sick man who lives in the house by the mill, so that he can have the sweet smell of our pine forest in his room all Christmas Day?" "Yes, dearie," said Granny, "you may do what you can to make the Christmas bright and happy, but you must not expect any present yourself." "Oh, but Granny," said little Gretchen, her face brightening, "you forget all about the shining Christmas angels who came down to earth and sang their wonderful song the night the beautiful Christ child was born. They are so loving and good that they will not forget any little child. I shall ask my dear stars tonight to tell them of us. You know," she added, with a look of relief, "the stars are so very high that they must know the angels quite well, as they come and go with their messages from the loving God." Granny sighed as she half whispered, "Poor child, poor child." But Gretchen threw her arms round Granny's neck and gave her a hearty kiss, saying as she did so, "Oh, Granny, Granny, you don't talk to the stars often enough, else you wouldn't be sad at Christmas time." Then she danced all around the room, whirling her little skirts about her to show Granny how the wind had made the snow dance that day. She looked so droll and funny that Granny forgot her cares and worries and laughed with little Gretchen over her new snow dance. The days passed on, and the morning before Christmas Eve came. Gretchen, having tidied up the little room, for Granny had taught her to be a careful little housewife, was off to the forest, singing a birdlike song, almost as happy and free as the birds themselves. She was very busy that day, preparing a surprise for Granny. First, however, she gathered the most beautiful of the fir branches within her reach to take the next morning to the old sick man who lived by the mill. The day was all too short for the happy little girl. When Granny came trudging wearily home that night, she found the frame of the doorway covered with green pine branches. "It's to welcome you, Granny! It's to welcome you!" cried Gretchen. "Our old dear home wanted to give you a Christmas welcome. Don't you see? The branches of evergreen make it look as if it were smiling all over, and it is trying to say, 'A happy Christmas' to you, Granny." Granny laughed and kissed the little girl. As they opened the door and went in together, here was a new surprise for Granny. The 4 posts of the wooden bed, which stood in one corner of the room, had been trimmed by the busy little fingers with smaller and more flexible branches of the pine trees. A small bouquet of red mountain ash berries stood at each side of the fireplace, and these, together with the trim posts of the bed, gave the plain old room quite a festival look. Gretchen laughed and clapped her hands and danced about until the house seemed full of music to poor, tired Granny, whose heart had been sad as she turned toward their home that night, thinking of the disappointment which must come to loving little Gretchen the next morning. After supper was over, little Gretchen drew her stool up to Granny's side, and laying her soft little hands on Granny's knee, asked to be told once again the story of the coming of the Christ child. How the night that he was born the beautiful angels had sung their wonderful song, and how the whole sky had become bright with a strange and glorious light, never seen by the people of earth before. Gretchen had heard the story many, many times before, but she never grew tired of it, and now that Christmas Eve had come again, the happy little child wanted to hear it once more. When Granny had finished telling it, the two sat quiet and silent for a little while, thinking it over. Then Granny rose and said it was time for them to go to bed. She slowly took off her heavy wooden shoes, such as are worn in that country, and placed them beside the hearth. Gretchen looked thoughtfully at them for a minute or two, and then she said, "Granny, don't you think that somebody in all this wide world will think of us tonight?" "Nay, Gretchen," said Granny, "I don't think anyone will." "Well, then, Granny," said Gretchen, "the Christmas angels will, I know. So I'm going to take one of your wooden shoes and put it on the window sill outside, so that they may see it as they pass by. I'm sure the stars will tell the Christmas angels where the shoe is." "Ah, you foolish, foolish child," said Granny. "You are only getting ready for a disappointment. Tomorrow morning there will be nothing whatever in the shoe. I can tell you that now." But little Gretchen would not listen. She only shook her head and cried out, "Oh, Granny, you don't talk enough to the stars." With this she seized the shoe, and opening the door, hurried out to place it on the window sill. It was very dark without, and something soft and cold seemed to gently kiss her hair and face. Gretchen knew by this that it was snowing, and she looked up to the sky, anxious to see if the stars were in sight. But a strong wind was tumbling the dark, heavy snow clouds about, and had shut away all else. "Never mind," said Gretchen softly to herself. "The stars are up there, even if I can't see them, and the Christmas angels do not mind snowstorms." Just then a rough wind went sweeping by the little girl, whispering something to her which she could not understand, and then it made a sudden rush up to the snow clouds, and parted them, so that the deep, mysterious sky appeared beyond, and shining down out of the midst of it was Gretchen's favourite star. "Ah, little star," said the child, laughing aloud, "I knew you were there, though I couldn't see you. Will you whisper to the Christmas angels as they come by that little Gretchen wants so very much to have a Christmas gift tomorrow morning, if they have one to spare, and that she has put one of Granny's shoes upon the window sill, ready for it?" A moment more, and the little girl, standing on tiptoe, had reached the window sill and placed the shoe upon it, and was back again in the house beside Granny and the warm fire. The two went quietly to bed. And that night, as little Gretchen knelt to pray to the Heavenly Father, she thanked Him for having sent the Christ child into the world to teach all mankind how to be loving and unselfish. And in a few moments she was quietly sleeping, dreaming of the Christmas angels. The next morning, very early, even before the sun was up, little Gretchen was awakened by the sound of sweet music coming from the village. She listened for a moment, and then she knew that the choir boys were singing the Christmas carols in the open air of the village street. She sprang up out of bed and began to dress herself as quickly as possible, singing as she dressed. While Granny was slowly putting on her clothes, little Gretchen, having finished dressing herself, unfastened the door and hurried out to see what the Christmas angels had left in the old wooden shoe. The white snow covered everything, trees, stumps, roads, and pastures, until the whole world looked like fairyland. Gretchen climbed up on a large stone which was beneath the window and carefully lifted down the wooden shoe. The snow tumbled off of it in a shower over the little girl's hands, but she did not heed that. She ran hurriedly back into the house, putting her hand into the toe of the shoe as she ran. Oh, Granny," she exclaimed. "You didn't believe the Christmas angels would think about us, but see, they have, they have. Here is a dear little bird nestled down in the toe of your shoe. Oh, isn't he beautiful?" Granny came forward and looked at what the child was holding lovingly in her hand. There she saw a tiny chickadee, whose wing was evidently broken by the rough and boisterous winds of the night before, and who had taken shelter in the safe, dry toe of the old wooden shoe. She gently took the little bird out of Gretchen's hands and skillfully bound his broken wing to his side, so that he need not hurt himself by trying to fly with it. Then she showed Gretchen how to make a nice warm nest for the little stranger, close beside the fire, and when their breakfast was ready, she let Gretchen feed the little bird with a few moist crumbs. Later in the day Gretchen carried the fresh, green boughs to the old sick man by the mill, and on her way home stopped to see and enjoy the Christmas toys of some other children whom she knew, never once wishing that they were hers. When she reached home, she found that the little bird had gone to sleep. Soon, however, he opened his eyes and stretched his head up, saying just as plain as a bird could say, "Now, my new friends, I want you to give me something more to eat." Gretchen gladly fed him again, and then, holding him in her lap, she softly and gently stroked his gray feathers until the little creature seemed to lose all fear of her. That evening Granny taught her a Christmas hymn and told her another beautiful Christmas story. Then Gretchen made up a funny little story to tell to the birdie. He winked his eyes and turned his head from side to side in such a droll fashion that Gretchen laughed until the tears came. As Granny and she got ready for bed that night, Gretchen put her arms softly around Granny's neck and whispered, "What a beautiful Christmas we have had today, Granny. Is there anything in the world more lovely than Christmas?" "Nay, child, nay," said Granny. "Not to such loving hearts as yours." End of Little Gretchen and the Wooden Shoe by Elizabeth Harrison. Story number 35 of the Children's Book of Christmas Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2012. Children's Book of Christmas Stories by various artists. Christmas on Big Rattle by Theodore Goodrich Roberts. Archer sat by the rude hearth of his Big Rattle camp, brooding in a sort of tired contentment over the spitting faggots of var and glowing coals of birch. It was Christmas Eve. He had been out on his snowshoes all that day, and all the day before, springing his traps along the streams and putting his deadfalls out of commission. Rather queer work for a trapper to be about. But Archer, despite all his gloomy manner, was really a sentimentalist who practiced what he felt. Christmas is a season of peace on earth, he had told himself while demolishing the logs of a sinister deadfall with his axe, and now the remembrance of his quixotic deed added a brightness to the fire and to the rough, undecorated walls of the camp. Outside the wind ran high in the forest, breaking and sweeping tide-like over the reefs of tree-tops. The air was bitterly cold. Another voice, almost as fitful as the sough of the wind, sounded across the night. It was the waters of Stone Arrow Falls, above Big Rattle. The frosts had drawn their bonds of ice and blankets of silencing snow over all the rest of the stream, but the white and black face of the falls still flashed from a window in the great house of crystal and threw out a voice of desolation. Sacobie Bear, a full-blooded Micmac, uttered a grunt of relief when his ears caught the bellow of Stone Arrow Falls. He stood still and turned his head from side to side, questioningly. "Good," he said. "Big Rattle off there. Archer's camp over there. I go there. Good enough." He hitched his old smooth-bore rifle higher under his arm and continued his journey. Sacobie had tramped many miles, all the way from ice-imprisoned Fox Harbor. His papoose was sick. His squaw was hungry. Sacobie's belt was drawn tight. During all that weary journey his old rifle had not banged once, although few eyes save those of Timberwolf and Lynx were sharper in the hunt than Sacobie's. The Indian was reeling with hunger and weakness, but he held bravely on. A white man, no matter how courageous and sinewy, would have been prone in the snow by that time. But Sacobie, with his head down and his round snowshoes padding, like the feet of a frightened duck, raced with death toward the haven of Archer's cabin. Archer was dreaming of a Christmas time in a great faraway city when he was startled by a rattle of snowshoes at his threshold and a soft beating on his door, like weak blows from mittened hands. He sprang across the cabin and pulled open the door. A short, stooping figure shuffled in and reeled against him. A rifle in a woolen case clattered at his feet. "Merry Christmas! How do?" said a weary voice. "Merry Christmas, brother," replied Archer. Then, "Bless me, but it's Sacobie Bear! Why, what's the matter, Sacobie?" "Heap tired, heap hungry," replied the Micmac, sinking to the floor. Archer lifted the Indian and carried him over to the bunk at the farther end of the room. He filled his iron pot spoon with brandy and inserted the point of it between Sacobie's unresisting jaws. Then he loosened the Micmac's coat and shirt and belt. He removed his moccasins and stockings and rubbed the straight, thin feet with brandy. After a while Sacobie Bear opened his eyes and gazed up at Archer. "Good," he said. "John Archer, he heap fine man, anyhow. Mighty good to poor Injun Sacobie, too. Plenty tobac, I s'pose? Plenty rum, too?" "No more rum, my son," replied Archer, tossing what was left in the mug against the log wall and corking the bottle. "And no smoke until you've had a feed. What do you say to bacon and tea? Or would tinned beef suit you better?" "Bake 'em," replied Sacobie. He hoisted himself to his elbow and wistfully sniffed the fumes of the brandy that came from the direction of his bare feet. "Heap waste of good rum, me tink," he said. "You ungrateful little beggar!" laughed Archer as he pulled a frying pan from under the bunk. By the time the bacon was fried and the tea was steeped, Sacobie was sufficiently revived to leave the bunk and take a seat by the fire. He ate as all hungry Indians do, and Archer looked on in wonder and whimsical regret, remembering the miles and miles he had tramped with that bacon on his back. "Sacobie, you will kill yourself," he protested. "Sacobie no kill himself now," replied the Micmac, as he bolted a brown slice and a mouthful of hard bread. "Sacobie more like to kill himself when he empty, want to live when he chock full. Good fun. Tank you for more tea." Archer filled the extended mug and poured in the molasses. "Long sweetenin', they call it in that region." "What brings you so far from Fox Harbor this time of year?" inquired Archer. "Squaw sick, papoose sick, boat empty. One good bacum to eat." Archer smiled at the fire. "Any luck trapping?" he asked. His guest shook his head and hid his face behind the upturned mug. "Not much," he replied presently. He drew his sleeve across his mouth and then produced a clay pipe from a pocket in his shirt. "Tobac?" he inquired. Archer passed him a dark and heavy plug of tobacco. "Knife?" queried Sacobie. "Try your own knife on it," answered Archer, grinning. With a sigh, Sacobie produced his sheath knife. "You tink Sacobie he big teef?" he said accusingly. "Knives are easily lost in people's pockets," replied Archer. The two men talked for hours. Sacobie Bear was a great gossip for one of his race. In fact, he had a Micmac nickname which, translated, meant "the man who deafens his friends with much talk." Archer, however, was pleased with his ready chatter and unforced humour. But at last they both began to nod. The white man made up a bed on the floor for Sacobie, with a couple of caribou skins and a heavy blanket. Then he gathered together a few plugs of tobacco, some tea, flour, and dried fish. Sacobie watched him with freshly aroused interest. "More tobac, please," he said. "Squaw, he smokes, too." Archer added a couple of sticks of black leaf to the pile. "Bake 'em, too," said the Micmac. "Bake 'em better nor fish, anyhow." Archer shook his head. "You'll have to do with the fish," he replied, "but I'll give you a tin of condensed milk for the papoose." "Ah, ah, him good stuff!" exclaimed Sacobie. Archer considered the provisions for a second or two. Then, going over to a dunnage bag near his bunk, he pulled its contents about until he found a bright red silk handkerchief and a red flannel shirt. Their colour was too gaudy for his taste. "These things are for your squaw," he said. Sacobie was delighted. Archer tied the articles into a neat pack and stood it in the corner, beside his guest's rifle. "Now you'd better turn in," he said, and blew out the light. In 10 minutes both men slept the sleep of the weary. The fire, a great mass of red coals, faded and flushed like some fabulous jewel. The wind washed over the cabin and fingered the caves, and brushed furtive hands against the door. It was dawn when Archer awoke. He sat up in his bunk and looked about the quiet, grey lighted room. Sacobie Bear was nowhere to be seen. He glanced at the corner by the door. Rifle and pack were both gone. He looked up at the rafters where his slab of bacon was always hung. It, too, was gone. He jumped out of his bunk and ran to the door. Opening it, he looked out. Not a breath of air stirred. In the east, saffron and scarlet broke the Christmas morning, and blue on the white surface of the world lay the imprints of Sacobie's round snowshoes. For a long time the trapper stood in the doorway in silence, looking out at the stillness and beauty. "Poor Sacobie," he said after a while. "Well, he's welcome to the bacon, even if it is all I had." He turned to light the fire and prepare breakfast. Something at the foot of his bunk caught his eye. He went over and took it up. It was a cured skin, a beautiful specimen of fox. He turned it over, and on the white hide an uncultured hand had written with a charred stick, "Archer." "Well, bless that old redskin!" exclaimed the trapper huskily. "Bless his puckered eyes! Who'd have thought that I should get a Christmas present?" End of Christmas on Big Rattle by Theodore Goodrich Roberts. End of The Children's Book of Christmas Stories by various artists.